So we're on Daf Yud Daled, and we're up to Tashma. So let's see if we could find the place. We are approximately 2/3 down the Amud, and we are, let's see, I have, and I'm just not sure if there's an easy way. You know what? Let's just count up from the bottom of the Amud. I think that's the most logical way of doing it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 lines up from the bottom. Now, what we're dealing with, just to remind you, and Mitch, you weren't here yesterday, so I'll just give you a little background. We're talking about Reish Lakish and the way he interpreted a pasuk called Lo Tisgodedu. That pasuk, Al Pi Pshuto Shel Mikra, prohibits creating wounds al hames. Al hames means as part of mourning and avelus over the loss of a close relative. However, Reish Lakish, from a very interesting diuk with an extra letter in the word Lo Tisgodedu, he derives an additional isur that the Torah prohibits dividing up Klal Yisrael, the tzibur of Yisrael, into different parts, in which each one has its own Torah, so to speak, its own laws. And by separating the laws, we have a violation of Lo Tisgodedu, Lo Tasu, Agudos, Agudos. So now,
what daf is this?
Yud Dalet, 10 lines up from the bottom of Yud Dalet Amud Aleph. Again, when I say 10 lines up, since you have the Masechet, I think you have the same exact Gemara that I have, correct? Okay.
Yeah.
You have it? Toshma. Afal pi she'elu osrim v'elu matirim lo nimnu beit Shammai militzad nashim mi beis Hillel. What happens is that Beis Hillel hold that Tsaras Erva Eino Misyabemis. Beit Shammai hold that Tsaras Erva Misyabemis. And it comes out that according to Beit Shammai, the tzara of an erva after Yibum, when she gives birth to a child, there's no problem with the status of the child. The Yuchsin are perfectly kosher v'yosher. Whereas according to Beis Hillel, that child is a mamzer, because since Beis Hillel maintained that Tsaras erva does not fall for Yibum, Memela she goes back to the erva of Eishes Ach, and the child of such a relationship is a mamzer. And nevertheless, the Mishnah testifies that there was no inhibition about intermarrying, so to speak, between the students and the generations of students of Beis Hillel and those of Beit Shammai. Even though, according to Beit Shammai, a Tsaras Erva is not allowed to get married without chalitza. So, for example, if one of the generations of Beit Shammai wants to marry a woman from Beis Hillel, if you're following me, they should, l'chora, if not for our Mishnah, we would have said they have to be careful about tsaros of erva, because in the case of tsaros erva, Beis Hillel allowed them to get married without chalitza, because the tsaros erva doesn't fall for yibum. Whereas according to Beit Shammai, that marriage is forbidden, and it might even generate mamzerus. That's called the Yevamot l'shuk. Now, whether or not Yevamot l'shuk generates a mamzeres, that's a different sugya. That's later on in Masechet Yevamot. It's not for us. And lo mi Beit Shammai lo Beis Hillel mi Beit Shammai. And in the reverse situation, Beis Hillel is marrying an offspring of the generations of Beit Shammai, who would allow for Yibum in the case of a Tsaras Erva, when the child from that marriage, according to Beis Hillel, is a mamzer. And the Gemara is now bothered If you're going to hold that Rav agrees with Reish Lakish, lo asu mishum hachi lo nimnu. We're going to have to assume lo asu. We had a machlokus earlier on this daf about whether or not Beit Shammai actually went through with it, so to speak, meaning they would actually encourage a yibum relationship between the Yavam and the Tsaris Arab. And Reish Lakish was one of the Amoraim who maintained loas, that Beit Shammai were worried and concerned about the Shita of Beis Hillel, which they totally rejected, but they had to be concerned about it. And they would not allow Yibum in a case of a Tsar Serv. Is Mishum Hachilo Nimnu. Now we can understand why the people of Beis Hillel, that camp, could marry into the people, the women coming from Beit Shammai, because Lamaisa, in actuality, there was never a situation where Beit Shammai would permit a Yibum to a Tsaris Erev. But if you say, like the other Shita, not Reish Lakish, namely Shmuel, and also Rabbi Yochanan, that also the Beit Shammai actually followed through. They lived up to their horah, to their word, and they would implement Yibum in the case of a Tsaris Erev. Is a Milo Nimnu. Why would the offspring of Beis Hillel allow a marriage to the offspring of Beit Shammai when we have mamzeres here? So the Gemara says, wait a minute. Bishlema, you could understand that Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel lo nimnu. You can understand why Beit Shammai would marry into Beis Hillel. We're going to assume, like that Shita, that Yevamot Ashuk does not generate mamzeres, meaning the Torah says, it's only a lav. And according to Beis Hillel, if we allow, which we will, the Tsaras Erev to get married to anyone, she doesn't fall for Yibum according to Beis Hillel, then Beit Shammai would say, well, that marriage is a marriage of Chayvei Lavin, but the children of that marriage are not considered mamzerim. Why? Because there's no chiyuv kares, and there's only mamzerus from a severe violation of forbidden relations that is at least kares or above kares. So if we're not assuming, like that shita, that there's mamzerus from Chayvei Lavin, like Rabbi Akiva and Rav, then we're fine. I understand that I can justify that Beit Shammai could marry someone from Beis Hillel. El Beis Hillel Beit Shammai Amailo Nimnu B'nei Chayvei Krisus Mamzerim Ninu. In the case of a Tsaris Erva who fell for Yibum, and according to Beit Shammai, she will actually be Misyabemes. She's an Eishes Ach, which is a Chiyuv Kares. And right, according to Beis Hillel, I mean to say she's Eishes Ach, because Beis Hillel holds that Tsaris Erva is not Misyabemes. Hence, the child of such a relationship would be a mamzer. How could they now marry into Beit Shammai? V'chi tema de kasari Beis Hillel. The ein mamzer michayve krisus. Maybe the line, the red line, according to Beis Hillel, is chayve mises bezdin. Chayve krisus itself would not be sufficient to generate mamzeres. There is such a shita, and Ali Gemara wants to identify Beis Hillel with that shita. And now, if we're going to assume that since Tsaras Erva, if she had Yibum, is according to Beis Hillel a violation of Eishes Ach. Eishes Ach is only a chiyuv kares. That's pretty serious, but it's not a chiyuv mises bezdin, and it doesn't generate mamzeres. Gemara says that's impossible. Ha'amar Abu Lazar, afal pisha nechleku Beit Shammai Beis Hillel b'tsaros. In other words, there's a machlokas about a tzaras erva, whether she is included in Yibum or she's exempt from Yibum. But Modim, they both agree, she'ein mamzer ella mimisha isuro isur erva v'anosh kares. And that means that even Beis Hillel would hold that someone who's born from chayve krisus is a mamzer. That's what it says explicitly here in the words of Rabbi Lazar. Modim means everybody agrees that in the case of an Isser Erva of Anush Kares, there is mamzerus. And therefore we have an explicit commitment, according to Rabbi Lazar, of Beis Hillel, that Eishes Ach, if she married, the child would be a mamzer. So again, we're back to our original question. How do we justify that Beis Hillel could marry the offspring of Beit Shammai when it might be getting involved in mamzerus, what we call psul kol? El lav shmamida lo asu. The only conclusion that would justify the Mishnah and permit the offspring of Beis Hillel to marry into the offspring of Beit Shammai would be if we assume lo asu, which is in fact the shita of Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, but it's a rejection of the shita of Reish Lakish and Rav of asu. Like I got the names mixed up. I'm sorry. Let me just correct myself for the record. It's Rav and Reish Lakish who hold lo asu, but Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan held asu. And we don't understand how to reconcile our Mishnah with Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan who hold asu. If it's asu, then there's no way that we can justify Beis Hillel marrying the offspring of Beit Shammai. And therefore, Shmamida, lo asu, we have to conclude, like Reish Lakish and Rav, that Beit Shammai would not actually allow the marriage between a tzaras erva and the yava. And Gemara rejects and says, lo, liolam asu, but the modile uparshi. And I've said many times that I don't understand the engineering of this, but in theory, what happened was that after Beit Shammai would, in their Batei Dinim, encourage Yibum of Tzaras Erva, they would notify Beis Hillel that this marriage is a marriage which, according to your sheet, the Beis Hillel, is Chayve Krisis, because, in your opinion, she's Eishes Ach. By notifying them, Beis Hillel knew exactly where to put the red X on those families that had a Yibum of a Tzaras Erva. So it means that there was a very careful examination on the part of Beis Hillel of the families before they would allow their girls, or their boys for that matter, to marry someone from the camp of Beit Shammai. They would have to do serious inquiries and investigations just to be sure that it's not one of those families where Tzaras Erva married her brother-in-law, meaning married the Yavam illegally, because there is no Yibum in Tzaras Erva going to Beis Hillel. And they would mark those families, like Cain was marked, in Pashas Gracious. And the Gemara now wants to bring a support from a careful reading of the Mishnah to prove that, in fact, Beit Shammai would notify Beis Hillel which families were out of bounds for Beis Hillel people, because there was a marriage of Tzaras Erva. The Katani Seifa, the Mishnah in the Seifa, gives the following analogy: Ola Taharos, Becholat Meos. There are many machlokas in Seder Taros about what's Tameh and what's Tar between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. Lo nimnu osim taros elu al gabi elu. Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel had no inhibitions about putting kalim from their camp onto kalim of the other camp, and in both directions. They would borrow kalim one from the other. Even though, according to Beis Hillel, we have to be machmir on the taros above and beyond Beis Shammai. And those kalim that Beis Shammai would make it on were in the view of Beis Hillel Tmeim, and yet the kalim would go on top of one on the other. They would put a kli of Beis Hillel on the kli of Beis Shammai. They weren't careful about contracting tumah. Now we turn to Daf Yudalad Amid Beis. The modoilahu. If you're going to tell me that Beis Shammai would notify Beis Hillel that these kalim are out of bounds, because in your opinion, Beis Hillel, they are tmein. We ruled that they are Torah. It's mishmachti lo nimnu. Now we can understand why Beis Hillel were not inhibited about putting the kalim on top of the kalim of Beis Shammai, because they knew exactly which kalim came under the kula of Beit Shammai when Beit Shammai were matarin them, which would be lechumra and tmeim according to Beis Hillel. If you're going to tell me that Beit Shammai couldn't care less, they didn't send any sort of notification to Beit Shammai, to Beis Hillel, is then Bishlam Beit Shammai mi Beis Hillel lo nimnu the tumas to Beis Hillel Beit Shammai Toros. The fact that Beis Hillel were more machmer and they were metame something, that doesn't have to bother Beis Hillel. Bother Beit Shammai, because okay, so that Tmeos according to Beis Hillel, we hold that they're Toros. But the other way around, Ela Beis Hillel mi Beit Shammai lama lo nimnu. What it means is that those that are Tohoros, according to Beit Shammai, are Tmeos according to Beis Hillel. And now what's going to happen is that Beis Hillel is going to rely and have contact with the kalim of Beit Shammai, not knowing that those kalim are Tmeos. So lama lo nimnu Tohoros mi Beit Shammai le Beis Hillel Tmeos ninu. That which Beis Shammai determined is tar, is tamei in the eyes of Beis Hillel. Elav, we have no choice but to assume modialu, that the people of Beit Shammai would be modia, they would notify Beis Hillel that these kalim are the kalim that you would be matama, even though we were matarid. Therefore, to the same extent in that part of the Mishnah, when we're talking about tumas and taros, the answer to the question of the lack of inhibition is modia lahu. The same thing is now going to apply with regard to mishpachos. That if there were families that implemented, according to Beit Shammai, a yibum of Etzaras Erva, Beit Shammai would notify Beis Hillel Shmam. The Gemara asks, Umay ume dahach nihach. In other words, why do you think that in order to prove this principle called modia lechu, I'm going to quote and invoke the sefer of the Mishnah with regard to taros? The same logic that compels you to draw the conclusion of modialu and taros and tmeos would certainly apply to the case of mishpachos regarding the Isur of Tzaras Erva. And so it's funny, you felt that in the case of mishpachos, you needed a proof. So you stretched your arm out to the case of tumas v'taros, and you made an analogy. Well, why is it any better in the case of Tuma and Tara to assume Odilahu than in the case of Mishpachos and Yibum? And the Gemara answers, I would have thought Sarah Kala Isle could be that Beit Shammai would be more lenient, or that's not a good word, but more laid back and less careful and meticulous about notifying Beis Hillel about a marriage of a tzara to a yavam, Tzaras Erva, I mean to say to a yavam, because of Kola Isla. They would rely on the fact that, people talk, and in the various, families and so forth, they know who married who, and there are rumors going around. And Beit Shammai would say, we don't have to notify Beis Hillel. They'll figure it out on their own. They'll get the message when they hear the rumor. Kamash Malan, no. We're going to say that just like in the case of Kalim, Beis Hillel would have to notify Beit Shammai that these Kalim, according to your sheet of Beis Hillel, are Tmeim. So too, in the case of Mishpachos, there is a responsibility incumbent upon the children of Beit Shammai to notify Beis Hillel These are the mishpachos which had a yibum of Tzaras Erva. You should not in any way rely, and Beit Shammai should not in any way rely on a kol. And this leads us up to Guf. Okay. Now, Omar Abulasa. Afal pisha nechleku Beit Shammai Beis Hillel b'tsaros. Modim she'ein mamzer ella mimisha isuro iser erva v'anush karis. We had quoted earlier a statement of Rabbi Elazar to the effect that there's a machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai about whether there's a chiyuv of tour of yibum in the case of a Tzaras Erva, but there was never a machlokes about the following principle: that if there's an Iser Erva, with the violation of that Iser Erva, you produce mamzerus. Now, let's analyze the language of Rabbi Elazar. He says, modim she'ein mamzer ella, etc., the Iser chayve krisis. What do you mean modim? What modim means, you have a machlokes, and you might have extended that machlokes, or extended one opinion in that machlokes, and therefore the machlokes itself, to another case. Modim, no. That case is more extreme, and it works with its own rules and regulations, and there's no machlokes about that case. But the machlokes here is about the status of its Tzaras Erva, whether she is included in Yibum or not. What bearing, what relevance does that have on the issue of what chumras onesh, what level of onshim in a case of a forbidden relationship, in the case of an erva, is necessary? That's the red line to generate, beyond which it's mamzerus. Okay, is it chayve lavim? Is it chayve krisus? Is it chayve misus bezdin? How severe and harsh of a violation would generate mamzerus? It's a very important question in and of itself, but it would seem to be totally independent of the issue of what's the status of a Tzaras Erva as far as Yibum is concerned. On Modim. So let's assume that, based on Beit Shammai at least, the tzara of an erva went ahead and was subject to Yibum with the Yavam, and the child would not be a mamzer, and a kol modim. What do you mean a kol modim? According to Beit Shammai, adarabah, this is an obligatory relationship. This marriage is recommended by the Torah. It's a Tzaras Erva falls for Yibum. So what do you mean? There's a hodah here that there'll be mamzeres? How can there be mamzeres according to Beit Shammai when the Torah commands him to marry the Tzaras Erva in the framework of Yibum? So the Gemara says the following: Ilema Beit Shammai. Then, in the context of Beit Shammai, in Tzaras Erva, his machlokes with Beis Hillel would be in the opposite direction. Namely, is there a requirement of chalitza in order to allow her to marry Echad min Hashuk? Beit Shammai would say she must have chalitza, otherwise it's the Yavam L'Shuk situation. Beis Hillel says she doesn't require chalitza at all. She's not a Yavam L'Shuk. There's no zikas yibum as far as the Taurus Erev is concerned. So then, the issue of mamzerus could theoretically come up, according to Beit Shammai, if the psak of Beis Hillel would allow this woman, the Taurus Erev, to marry someone min hashuk. Would the child of such a relationship be classified as a mamzer? So the Gemara says, no, I don't need Rabbi Lazar to address that question. I don't need Rabbi Lazar to tell me that Beit Shammai would be moded to Beis Hillel, that there's no mamzerus here in this case. If the Tsaris Erva married someone min hashuk without chalitza, which is the psak of Beis Hillel. Why? Because Yavam L'Shuk is only an Isur La. And Rabbi Elazar is talking about an Isur Kares. Mamzerus, again, accepting one shita, where there could be Mamzerus in an Isur La, but leaving that shita on the side, our thrust of halacha is that there's no mamzerus unless there's at least chayve krisus and above. So the Gemara says, "Ilay Beit Shammai leBeis Hillel, Beit Shammai amoda to Beis Hillel, pshita b'nei chayve lavim sherenin." The psul kol of a mamzer only applies in a relationship that is chayve krisus, not in a relationship of chayve lavim. And Yavam L'Shuk is merely chayve lav. The Torah never says that if a Yavama gets married L'Shuk without chalitza, she violates or he violates an Isur Kares. There's no havamin of that. So it's just a lav like any other lav. And therefore there's no havamin to be mamzerus out of this relationship. It's only chayve lav. So why would Rabbi Elazar have to tell me that Beit Shammai are moded to Beis Hillel that there's no mamzerus? Well, what's the havamin that there would be mamzerus? Ella, now we have no choice but to do it in the other direction. That Beis Hillel are modeh to Beit Shammai. That's also a little bit strange, because when you say modeh, what you're saying is that a certain principle, which should have applied, I admit doesn't apply. Right? There's a level of admission. That's called hodah. There's no level of admission here of hodah. I mean, we're talking about chayve krisus. According to Beis Hillel, the status of Tsaras Erva is equal to that of the Erva herself. And vis-a-vis the Yavam, she is chayve krisus. So what are you telling me you modim? I mean, we have a principle that chayve krisus generates mamzerus. Ella, Beis Hillel, Beit Shammai, he gufa chayve krisus. The status of a Tsaras Erva is that of an Eishes Ach, shalom makom mitzvah. And what was the havamina that we need a modim here? I mean, modim that is mamzerus from chayve krisus. I mean, what's modim? I mean, the language here of Rabbi Lazar is modim she'ein mamzer ella mi'onish kares. These are erev shonish kares. This is an erev of chorish kares. What do you mean modim? Modim would be that there's no erva, but there is an erva. Modim would be that there's no mamzerus and psul kol, but there is mamzerus and psul kol. We're talking about a violation of, according to Beis Hillel, of Eishes Ach, of a chi of kares, and the child therefore would be a mamzer. Li olam, says the Gemara, Beit Shammai le Beis Hillel. There is a havamina that in the case of a Yavam L'Shuk, the child of such a marriage relationship would be a mamzer, and that's based on Rabbi Akiva, which Rabbi Akiva holds that yesh mamzerus michayve lavim, even though the status of the avera between a Yavama and Shuk is that of a lav, it's not a chi of kares, but nevertheless, yesh mamzerus michayve lavim according to Rabbi Akiva. So this Rabbi Lazar is pointing out that in the context of Beis Hillel, Beit Shammai, who have machlokas about Tsaras Erva, this has no bearing on Mamzeris, at least from the perspective of Beit Shammai vis-a-vis Beis Hillel, meaning a Yevamot Ashuk who didn't get Chalitza, or she's a Tzaras Erva, which, according to Beis Hillel, who does not require Chalitza. That is not going to generate Mamzerus because we don't accept Rabbi Akiva. Li'olam Beit Shammai Beis Hillel. If you're telling me Beit Shammai Beis Hillel, so why would Beit Shammai even dream of Mamzerus? La Fuke de Rabbi Akiva, the Yom Yesh Mamzer, Michayve Lavim. Kamash Malondi Ein Mamzer Michayve Lavim. So the bottom line is Rabbi Lazar is accepting the Chachamim's view and rejecting that of Rabbi Lazar in the case of Chayve Lav. There is no Mamzerus from Chayve Lav. Now, before we go on, let's just emphasize once again that there's a machlokas between Reish Lakish and Rav on the one side of the fence and Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel on the other with regard to the question of whether Beit Shammai allowed and implemented their ruling that at Tzaras Erva should be Mesyabemis. And according to Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, Asu Kidivrei, Toshma. Let's read the following price. Afal Pisha Nechleku Beit Shammai Beis Hillel B'Tzaros. We have machlokas whether it's Tzaras Erva falls for Yibum or not. The Achayos. They have a similar machlokas Beis Hillel Beit Shammai with regard to Achayos. And that's a Gemara later on Daf Chavav. Then they have a machlokas beget Yoshan, and a machlokas in Safek Eshes Ish, and a Megarishes Ishto, and Lana Imo Bepundak, and they have machlokas at the Shir of Kesef and Kedushin, whether it's Bekesef, Beshava Kesef, or Bepruta, or Beshava Pruta. So we have a machlokas in all these dinim. We'll go through them one by one in Mitzvah Hashem. And in each case, we're going to see that the Isser Arayos depends upon which opinion you take in a machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. Lo nimnu Beit Shammai milisa noshim mi Beis Hillel, lo nimnu Beis Hillel milisa noshim mi Beit Shammai, l'lamdecha shechiba v'reus noagim zebozeh, l'kayim ashenemar ha'emes v'asholom ehov. And Rav Shimon Omer nimnu hein min avadai v'lo nimnu min asaf. As a general rule, they were inhibited about intermarriage, but not in the case of a saf. The Gemara says, now we can prove Asu K'divrayim. Iyamrit, Asu, Beit Shammai followed through, and they had Yibum of Tzaras Erva, is Mishum Hachi Nimna'u. Now we begin to understand why Beis Hillel would not marry the Noshim of Beit Shammai. Because if Beit Shammai would allow for Yibum of Tzaras Erva, then we're talking about Mamzerus. Ela Iyamrit Lo Asu. If we're going to assume, like the Shita Reish Lakish, that Beis Shammai would not allow Yibum B'fal, an actuality between the Tzaras Erva and the Yavam, is then, I don't understand, Amai Nimnu. Why were Beis Hillel inhibited about marrying into the families of Beit Shammai? Because even Beit Shammai would not allow Yibum B'fal in these cases of a Tzaras Erva. Okay, then let's go through the whole list now, from the top. First, we have achios. Okay. So now, Mitch, you have the Masifta, correct? Yeah. So we're looking now, just to make sure we're all on the same page, Yud Dalet Amud Beis, and it's Aleph in brackets, Aleph, and it's the last paragraph in the text itself. The Achios. Okay. So now we have 4 brothers, 2 of which married 2 sisters. And those that married 2 sisters died without children. And their wives fell for Yibum for the other 2 brothers. Achios elu cholzos v'lo misyabos. The 2 sisters that were married to, let's call it Reuben and Shimon, they require chalitza, but they don't fall for Yibum. There's no possibility of Yibum in this case of the 2 brothers married to the 2 sisters. Those 2 sisters do not have a Yibum situation. Why? Because here we have what's called Zika L'Shnei Achim. Do you follow? She has a Zika as each one of these 2 women as a result of 2 brothers, because the 2 brothers died without children. And Zika is considered like an Ishus. So each one of these 2 women are considered Achos Kukaso, which Midrabanan is considered like Achos Ishta. And therefore Yibum is out of the question. Now we have a Machlokas Beisil Beit Shammai. The 2 brothers that are still alive went ahead illegally, and they married the 2 wives of their older brothers, the 2 sisters. Beit Shammai Omer b'di'eved yekaimu v'lo yotziu osam. We're not going to compel a divorce. We're going to allow the marriage to continue, despite the fact that Midrabanan, he's marrying Achos Kukasa, which is like Achos Ishto, who Beis Hill Omrim after the Eved Shekvar Konsu Yotziu Osam. Each one of the brothers, the live brothers, if he married one married this sister and the other married the other sister, they have to deliver again, each one to his wife. Next, get Yoshan. What's a get Yoshan? This is a get in which a husband writes the get, meaning he authorizes the sofer to write the get. And as you know, a get has to be written lishma, l'shem ha'ish, l'shem ha'isha. And then he went ahead and after commissioning the writing of the get, before he actually delivered the get, he, the Baal, was in a private room with his wife. Beit Shammai holds the get is still kosher. Beis Hill says, no. The get is possible. Why? What we're afraid of, says Beis Hillel, is that if we validate this get, then perhaps during that yichud period, they went too far, if you know what I mean. So they consummated an intimate relationship and she became pregnant. Now, you and I know that the get was given after she became pregnant, but the onlookers don't know that. They don't know what came first, her ibur when she was impregnated, or the get itself. Therefore, we have a gzera, says Beis Hillel, that we have to be afraid that the onlookers will say that the get came first, and then afterwards she became pregnant. Now, what's so terrible about that? One second. Jeff, do you have, if I remember from yesterday, Jeff, you have an art scroll? Can you, I don't know, the Masifta doesn't seem to do it for me here. Occasionally happens. I'm a big fan of Masifta, but what is the problem of get kodem liburo? If people would say that he already gave her the get, I mean, okay, so she got pregnant from him after the get. So what does that mean? Is that's not mamzerus? Do you have anything there, maybe? If you...
I'm looking.
Doesn't he talk about it in comment Vav underneath the line?
I don't know. Vav is, he says, Hikshat Tosfis, Are Ika Laman Diomer Bigitin, Ja'af Beis Hillel Lo Asru, Elegalish Vav B'Dievenim Girishbo, Tinose Aflachatchila. I don't. I mean, again, it's a very nice footnote with a beautiful kash from Tosfos, but I think he's skipping the basics. He assumes we know what is the issue here. I don't see it in the Masifta. It's probably there, but I'm just missing it. Maybe we'll take a look in Rashi. Usually Masifta covers the entire Rashi. Let's see. Now I'm not finding the Rashi. You know, I'm going to stretch my head out here, unless there's something, Jeff, that you can enlighten me. What's that phrase in English? You know, put your head down on the chopping board or something. I'm going to say the following, that there's an issue here of kahuna. Let me just see if I could work this out. If she became pregnant after the get was delivered, then a Kohen should not marry the daughter of that pregnancy, the daughter that's born to that pregnancy. Why? Because in kahuna, we have what's called Mila B'Yuchsin, that we upgrade the status of Yuchsin and the requirements of Yuchsin regarding vis-a-vis a Kohen. And a woman born out of wedlock, which is what's classically called Pania Bola Pnuya, but here it's a case of a Grusha having a relationship with her own ex, as they call it today. So that's Pania Bola Pnuya. Then the Vlad is a Pogum. Pogum means should not be married off to a Kohen. Again, I'm not paskening halacha here. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying, in the pure theory of it, a Kohen should not be married to a girl who was born out of wedlock, even though, again, there's no mamzerus, there's no psul kahuna. Alternatively, maybe I could even sharpen it a little more. There's one man diomar that holds pani abala pliyasa ma'azona. Yeah, but now we're not talking about a Kohen. Just 1 second. Zona. And it could be that the child of the Zona is a Chalola and cannot marry a Kohen. Again, we have to open up a Gemara and Git and then go through the sugi of Get Yashar, which right now, I don't think it's so compelling. But let's go on to Suffolk Ashesi. And Jeff, if you find anything, please, interrupt us. I used to have an art school, but I think I returned it to its owner. Right, that's Bateson. All right, now we go on to Suffolk Ashes Ish. So again, a father, as we've mentioned many times, can marry off his daughter who's a ketana. And in a case where a ketana doesn't have a father, then either her mother or her brother, one of her brothers, is allowed to marry her off. And that's called kiddushay miyun, which means that midrabanan, that marriage is valid and it requires miyun, nothing more than miyun. She just says, I'm out. Now, Ketana Zu, this Ketana, who could have been Mima'enes, is called a Suffolk Ashes Ish. We never know exactly when or if or when she will be Mima'enes. Now, Miyun, and we mentioned this in the past, is Oker l'Nesuin l'Mafreya. It retroactively means they were never married. And later on in Masechet Yevamot, we're going to have machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai about the nature of miyun in a ketana. And then we have Megarishes Ishto Vilona Imo Bifunda. Again, this is very similar to the other machlokas that we had about Get Yoshan. In this case, after the divorce, he was misyached with his ex, and Beit Shammai say that we don't have to worry about remarriage. Okay, maybe he had a lustful relationship with her, and he may have gone too far, but he didn't marry her. She doesn't need to get now to marry anyone else. They still say, though, she needs a second get. The first get is not sufficient to allow her to get married, because we're going to be choshesh that maybe when he had a relationship with her during that yichud in a fundak, he actually had in mind marrying. Now, why would we assume that a man who's, going illegally into an inn is going to have a marriage relationship? It looks like just a one-night stand, if you pardon the phrase. But the answer is we have a chazaka in halacha called Ein Adam Osa Bilaso Bilasnus. That if a man has a relationship with a woman who's not married, the assumption is, unless we know she's an Erev or something like that, that he had in mind L'Shem Kiddushin, L'Shem Ish. He doesn't want to be less than this. Hence, Beis Hillel would assume A plus B, A, that in this fundiki, he had a relationship with her, and B, that his relationship with her was for the express intention of marriage, and therefore she needs a second gift. Question is where the Adam over here. We're going to have to apply the principle of Hein Heine de Yichud, Hein Heine de Bia, that when he goes into this private place with her, he takes a night in an inn with her, that he must have had a relationship with her. Now we have another machlokas about what's the minimum value of kesef for Kiddushin. Beit Shammai are of the opinion that it cannot be less than a dinar. B'dinar kesef u'b'shava dinar kesef, and Beit Hillel hold b'pruta u'b'shava. Now, let's take, for example, this last case. Just as one example, we'll see if we could apply this straight down the line in all the cases. A man married a woman with a pruta. According to Beit Hillel, she's an HSH. According to Beit Shammai, she's not an HSH because the minimum share of kesef for Kiddushin is a dinar. Now, according to Beit Shammai, she doesn't need a get. So if she goes ahead and has a relation with another man, no problem with the Vlad. Whereas according to Beit Hillel, she's a full-fledged HSH. And the Vlad from another man, if she doesn't get a get from this guy, is a mamzer. So we see that you can have problems of intermarriage here between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Like my father told me that in his youth, it's hard to even believe, a marriage between a Litvak and a Glitziana was considered a mixed marriage. So my father actually married a Glitziana, my mother's family. Anyway, so what are we going to do Beit Hillel Beit Shammai in this case? Now let's take another example. Let's talk about Megarishes Ishtav Alana Imo Bepundiki. According to Beit Hillel, we're assuming that in this Pundiki he had a relationship with her and for the purpose of marriage. She now needs a second get from her ex because it was a new marriage. She doesn't get a second get. According to Beit Hillel, the child of a relationship between her and another man without a get is a mamzer. According to Beit Shammai, there's no mamzeris. She doesn't require a get. Now, in the case of Get Yoshin, it's a little bit more confusing, because now we're talking about Gzeira D'Rabbanan. And according to Beit Shammai, this get is a perfectly viable get, even though between the writing of the get and the giving of the get, he had a private relationship with her, a yichud relationship with her. But according to Beit Hillel, the get is possible, albeit midrabanan. And if she goes ahead and has a relationship with another man without getting a real bona fide get, which is kosher v'yasher, then the child is a mamzer, albeit midrabanan. The complicated case is suffocation cease because we don't know enough about miyun and tan and the machlokes between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai to evaluate that. And then we go on and we see in this brisa that lo nimnu Beit Shammai milisa Beit Hillel, lo nimnu Beit Hillel Beit Shammai milisa Beit Hillel, chachiba reyes and all that stuff about chiba reyes. But now we have a problem of mamzeros. Very profound, a profound problem. So Reb Shimon says that with all due respect to that wonderful principle called emes v'shalom ehavu, but nevertheless, nimnu hein min avadai v'lo nimnu min asafek. They would not marry one family into the other. They were inhibited about doing so in a case of an Isur Vadai. So let's take, for example, the case of a Tzaras Ereva. That's an Isur Vadai. And we're talking about Mamzeris. So certainly, according to Beit Hillel, if the Tzaras Ereva of Beit Shammai got married to the Yavam, we're talking about Mamzeris. In a case of a Tzaras Ereva that didn't receive Chalitza and she married someone min Ashuk, according to Beit Shammai, we're dealing with a violation of an Isur Lav of the Yavam Ashuk, and therefore they don't have to be inhibited about marrying a woman from the family of Beit Hillel, lest she be a Yavam Ashuk marriage, because there's no Mamzeris. However, lo nimnu min asafek. Lo nimnu milisa nashim Sha'af l'shitasav einon asuris ella machmas safek. So let's take the case of Lana Imo Befundiki. And he didn't give her a second get after he took her for a night into the inn. And the assumption now is that even Beis Hillel, who require a second get, that's based on a suffix ish. We're afraid that maybe A, he had a beer with her, and B, that beer was the same kedusha. In such a case, even according to Reb Shimon, there'd be no reason for Beis Shammai, for Beis Hillel, to be inhibited about marrying someone from Beit Shammai. Why? Because that's only a suffix HSC. Now, when you think about it, first of all, I'm not sure why Lana Imo B'Fundik is only a suffix. We assumed before that is a vade eino demosa bilasa bilas nus, but maybe because we don't know whether they actually had bia in the fundiki. So the percentages here work out to a suffix. But why aren't Beis Hillel worried about a suffix each? Which is the same as a suffix moms. You're not allowed to marry a suffix moms. So I think what's going on here is chazakas, meaning she has a chazaka of being a grusha, and she's allowed to marry someone. And now the fundiki situation creates a suffix on her chazaka. And we're going to say that we're not going to remove and undermine a chazaka even based on some sort of a reusa in that chazaka. I mean, if she's a cheskas grusha, why is he spending a night with her in a funda? Okay, that's a reusa on the chazaka, but the chazaka still remains a chazaka. And therefore, Beis Hillel would agree that if he went ahead and refused to give her a get, or he flew the coop and she went ahead and got married to another man, the child from that marriage is not a mom's, because her chazaka is based on the only get that she got, that she's a grush. So the Gemara says the following: let's prove that asu kidivreya, that shita of Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. We now understand why Beis Hillel had to be inhibited about marrying someone from Beit Shammai, because of the problem of tzaras erva, which is a vada iser, vada moms. Ela iamet lo asu, if you're going to hold like Reish Lakish and Rav, that Beis Shammai Lamaisa did not allow this Yibum to take place, is Amai Nimnu. Why should there be any inhibition here? Because even Beit Shammai would not allow a tzaras erva to be misyabenes. That's a pretty strong raya from this brisa to support the opinion of Loas, of Asu. I'm sorry, let me get that right. Of Asu. Because of Asu, therefore Nimnu. Asu equals Nimnu. And in this brisa, we said Nimnu, except for the case of Suffolk. In the case of Vadai, Nimnu. So that makes sense if you hold Asu. But if you hold Lo Asu, why Nimnu? Why would they be inhibited if Lamaisa Beit Shammai never implemented their theoretical halacha that tzaras erva is misyabem? V'tizbara, nehim nami diasu, bishlei v'veisil nimnu. Okay, fine. All right, so this is, let's make a note. We got up to V'tizbara. Okay, then, and that is here on Daf Yudalid Amid Beis. About 2/3 down the Yom. So we'll be there. That's where we'll pick it up tomorrow.